I was 26 when I decided I needed to get away from everything. That's the kind of sentence that sounds dramatic in retrospect, but at the time it was just practical. I had 2 weeks of vacation saved up. I'd just gotten out of a 4-year relationship, and my therapist, who I was seeing exactly twice a month and not getting much out of, had said something about intentional solitude that stuck with me. So I rented a cabin. It was in western North Carolina, up in a stretch of the Appalachians that doesn't get much tourist traffic after October. The listing said it slept 6, had a wood-burning fireplace, and was a short drive from the nearest town, which turned out to mean 40 minutes on a road that had no guardrails for the last 8 of those miles. I booked it for 10 nights. I packed books, a cast iron pan, 2 bottles of whiskey, and enough groceries to not have to leave if I didn't feel like it. The plan was nothing. No itinerary. Just quiet. The cabin was exactly what the photos showed. A brown A-frame on a small flat clearing, surrounded by spruce trees on 3 sides, a steep slope dropping away behind it. The nearest neighbour, according to the host, was a couple about 1.5 miles down the access road. There was no cell service at the cabin itself. There was a landline. I wrote down the number of the host and the county sheriff and taped both to the fridge, which felt like something a cautious person would do, and I was trying to be a cautious person. The first 3 days were exactly what I needed. I read a whole novel. I slept 9 hours both nights. I hiked about 2 miles each morning down the slope behind the cabin and back up, and the effort of it cleared my head in a way that nothing had in months. I felt genuinely better. I started journaling, which I'd never done seriously before, and it wasn't embarrassing. It just felt useful. On the 4th morning, I noticed the welcome mat was moved. I know how that sounds, but hear me out. I'm someone who notices spatial things. I worked as a graphic designer for years. I have a pretty calibrated sense of where objects are in relation to each other. The welcome mat, a thick rubber one, dark green, rectangular, had been flush against the front door when I arrived. I remember stepping over it when I carried in the last box of groceries, because it was slightly curled on one end, and I didn't want to trip. On the 4th morning it was angled, maybe 30 degrees off from where it had been, pushed slightly away from the door. I told myself wind. It was a rubber mat on a wood porch, and there had been gusts overnight. I straightened it and went back inside. That night I woke up at 2 a.m. For no reason I could name. Not a sound, not a bad dream, just awake suddenly, the way you sometimes are. I lay there for a while, and then got up to get water. The kitchen window faced the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the cabin. I stood at the sink and looked out because there was a half moon and I could see the shapes of the spruce trees, and there was something calming about it, that dark tree line against the slightly lighter sky. I stood there for probably 90 seconds, and then I realized there was a gap in the tree line that I didn't think had been there before. Just a vertical dark space between 2 trees, wider than the others. I stared at it. After a while, the gap wasn't there anymore. The trees looked even again. I went back to bed. I genuinely thought eyes adjusting to the dark, movement of branches, something totally explainable. I was not a person who spooked easily. I'd grown up partly rural. I'd done solo camping before. I was not scared of the woods. But on the 6th day, I found the journal. It was in the drawer of the bedside table, on the side of the bed I wasn't sleeping on. I always sleep on the same side, left side, and the right side drawer I hadn't opened once. Inside the drawer there was a pocket notebook, the small spiral-bound kind with a black cover. It looked old, not ancient, but the cardboard was soft the way things get when they've been exposed to humidity for a long time. A few pages had been written in. I read them. It was a log, dates and brief notes. The dates were from about 3 years prior. Most of the entries were mundane, weather notes, wildlife spotted, the kind of quiet observations a previous guest had made. But the last entry, written in handwriting that was slightly different from the rest, slightly more pressured, the pen pushed harder into the page, said, "Third night in a row. Whatever it is, it knows I'm here now." That was the last entry. I put the notebook back in the drawer. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. I didn't leave early. I want to be clear about that. I stayed the full 10 nights, partly because I'm stubborn, and partly because in the daylight, nothing felt wrong. Nothing happened again that I couldn't talk myself out of, but I also didn't sleep well after that. And every morning, without thinking about it, I checked whether the welcome mat had moved. It had. Not every night, but 3 more times before I left, it was angled away from the door. I've looked up the property listing a few times since then. It's still available to rent. I've thought about emailing the host and asking about that notebook, asking whether other guests have mentioned anything, but I haven't done it yet. I'm not sure I want the answer to confirm anything, and I'm not sure I want it to not. My wife and I had been doing one big hiking trip a year since before we got married. It started as a way to force ourselves to take real vacation and became something we genuinely looked forward to. The summer we've been together 12 years, we decided on a trail in the Colorado Rockies, a 4-day out and back, that the guidebook rated strenuous but accessible. We were both in decent shape. We'd done harder things. We packed well, filed our trip plan with the ranger station, and set out on a Tuesday morning in July. The first day was perfect. I mean that without any irony. Perfect weather, good trail, a campsite at about 10,000 feet, with a view of a valley that looked like something from a painting. My wife took about 40 photos. We cooked freeze-dried pasta, and it tasted better than it had any right to, and we went to sleep at 9:30 because we were tired in the clean, satisfying way you only get from a full day of physical work. The second day, we passed another group coming back down, 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all wearing quality gear and looking fit and healthy, except that they were moving fast. Faster than you'd normally move on a descent if you weren't in a hurry. My wife said hi as they passed, and all 3 of them responded. But the last one, a man, maybe 40, sunglasses pushed up on his head, paused for just a second and said, "Are you going up to the second lake?" We said yes, that was the plan. Why? He looked at the other 2, who had kept walking. Then he looked back at us and said, "Nothing. Just keep your camp neat." And then he walked on. We looked at each other. I almost called after him to ask what that meant, but they were already around the switchback. We told ourselves it was a bare warning. Keep your camp neat, hang your food, don't leave attractants out. Standard bear country advice, even if the delivery was weird. We kept going. The second lake was beautiful. We set up camp on a flat stretch of granite shelf above the water and did everything right. Bear canister, no food in the tent, dishes cleaned and packed away. We were responsible people. We'd been in bear country before. Sometime in the middle of the second night, I woke up because my wife was already awake, lying very still, staring at the ceiling of the tent. "Something's outside," she said very quietly. I listened. There was something, a sound that I initially catalogued as wind, then realized wasn't. It was rhythmic in a way wind isn't, a slow, regular, heavy sound. Like breathing, like something large standing very close to the tent and breathing. I want to be careful here about what I say I know versus what I think I know. I don't know it was breathing. It was a sound consistent with breathing. It was close. It was very regular. It went on for what felt like 4 or 5 minutes, and neither of us moved, and then it stopped. In the morning, we found the ground around the tent. The soil between the granite and the tree line was soft enough to hold impressions. There were prints. I've spent a fair amount of time looking at wildlife track guides since, and I genuinely cannot tell you with confidence what they were. They were large. They were not clearly any of the shapes I'd expect, not the round pad and claw marks of a bear, not the split hoof of an elk. They were irregularly spaced, like whatever made them had an unusual gait. There were maybe 8 of them, in a loose arc around the back half of the tent, and then they stopped, just stopped, on solid granite where they couldn't leave any impression. We took photos. We finished the hike. When we got back to the trailhead and drove to cell service, I sent the photos to a wildlife biologist I found through a university extension office. She came back to me 3 days later and said she wasn't able to make a confident identification, and asked where exactly the trail was and whether we'd filed a report with the ranger station. We hadn't filed a report. We did after she asked. The ranger we spoke to said they'd had a couple of unusual wildlife sightings in that zone that summer, and that we'd done everything right. He didn't say what the sightings were. I asked, and he said he wasn't at liberty to elaborate. I don't know what that means. I've thought about it most days since. I drive for work, not a trucker. I'm a pharmaceutical sales rep, which means long days behind the wheel, covering a territory that, where I'm based in rural Montana, includes a stretch of US highway that climbs up through a mountain pass. The pass closes in serious winter weather, but in early winter, November, early December, it's open and mostly clear, just cold and sometimes slick if the temperature drops overnight. I've driven that stretch probably 400 times. The night in question I was heading home from a hospital call that had run late, about 11 p.m, clear sky, temperature around 18 degrees. I was tired, but not dangerously tired, and I knew that road well enough that I wasn't thinking about it much. Just driving. About 6 miles below the summit, my headlights caught something on the shoulder. It was a person, standing on the right shoulder facing away from me, toward the guardrail and the darkness beyond it. There's nothing beyond the guardrail there, just a slope dropping down into trees. Standing there, totally still, in what looked like a light jacket. No hat, no gloves that I could see. No reflective gear of any kind. I slowed down. My first thought was car trouble, someone whose car had gone off the road or broken down. But there was no car. The shoulder was empty in both directions. The person didn't move when my headlights swept over them, didn't turn around, didn't react at all. I pulled over about 50 yards past them and sat there for a second. You stop for people who need help. That's the deal. I got out of my car. The second I got out, the temperature hit me. 18 degrees at elevation with that altitude wind is meaningfully cold, and this person was standing there in a jacket. I walked back toward them, calling out as I got close that I was going to ask if they were okay. They turned around. I don't have a good way to describe what was wrong with their face. Nothing was. That's what I keep coming back to. It was a normal face, a man's face, middle-aged, no visible distress. His expression was completely blank in a way that didn't match the situation at all. He looked at me the same way you might look at a wall. No acknowledgement, no relief, no alarm. I asked if he needed help, if he'd had an accident, if his car was somewhere. He didn't answer any of those questions. He said, very flatly, "How far is it to the top?" I told him 6 miles, roughly. I asked again if he needed a ride, if he was okay. He looked past me, up the highway, toward the summit. Then he said, "I'm fine." And he turned back around, toward the guardrail. I stood there for a probably embarrassing amount of time. I genuinely didn't know what to do. There was no one else on that road. It was 11 at night, 18 degrees. Finally I said, "I can give you a ride to the summit. There's a pull-off up there." He didn't respond. Didn't move. Just stood there, looking over the guardrail. I went back to my car. I sat there with the heat running for maybe 3 minutes, watching him in my mirrors, completely still, facing the drop. Then I called the highway patrol non-emergency line and reported a person on the shoulder. They said they'd send someone to check. I drove to the summit, turned around, drove back down. He was gone. The shoulder was empty. The highway patrol called me back about 45 minutes later. They said they'd driven the full length of that grade and found no one. No car. No one on foot. I asked if they thought he'd gone over the guardrail. There was a pause. They said they'd documented the call and would check again at first light. I don't know what that means. I've been driving that pass for 11 years. I've never stopped again at night. We moved to a small mountain town in Idaho for my husband's job. Population under 3,000. The kind of place where everyone knows the family names, where people leave their cars unlocked, where the sense of community is real and warm and felt like something we'd been missing. We moved from Phoenix, and the adjustment was everything. The cold, the quiet, the stars at night. The fact that our nearest grocery store was 40 minutes away. But we loved it. We genuinely, immediately loved it. The house we rented was on the edge of town, where the neighborhood just kind of dissolved into the mountain slope above it. Our backyard ended at a chain-link fence, and beyond the fence was a steep wooded hillside that went up for probably a mile before it flattened out. The previous tenant had left a hanging bird feeder on the back porch which we kept filled, and we got a lot of use out of that back porch. It became our evening ritual: hot drinks, the tree line, whatever animals came to the feeder. Our first spring there, we started noticing that the birds stopped coming around dusk. Just stopped. The feeder would be busy all afternoon, and then, around the last 45 minutes before dark, nothing. Total quiet. The birds in the trees would go quiet too. It felt noticeable enough that I mentioned it to a neighbor, a woman in her 60s who'd lived there her whole life. She nodded, immediately, like I'd said something obvious. "That's just the mountain," she said. I asked what she meant. She thought about it for a second, in the careful way people do when they're deciding how much to say. "Animals know things we don't," she said. "When they go quiet, we go inside." She smiled, warm and matter-of-fact. "That's just how it is up here." I assumed she meant predators, mountain lion maybe, or something that came down at dusk. That made sense. We started going inside when the birds went quiet. About 2 months in, I was inside washing dishes at dusk, and my husband called me to the back porch. He was standing very still, looking up the slope beyond the fence. He said very quietly, "Look at the tree line." I looked. I didn't see anything at first, and then I did, something at the edge of the trees, in the shadows just inside the wood line. A figure, standing upright, taller than a person, or about the height of a tall person. It was hard to tell with the shadow and the slope, just standing there, at the tree line, looking, toward us, I think, toward our light. We stood there on the porch for what felt like a full minute. The figure didn't move. Eventually I said we should go inside, and we went inside and I locked the back door, which I'd never bothered doing before. In the morning, we walked up the slope to the tree line. The ground was soft from snowmelt. We were looking for tracks, for some explanation. We found something. The grass and soil just inside the tree line was flattened in a rough oval, like something had been standing there for a long time. The flattening was fresh. Nothing else, no clear prints, no scat, nothing we could photograph convincingly. We're still in that town. We love it. We go inside when the birds go quiet, without discussing it, because that's just how it is up here. Our neighbor waves when she sees us from her porch, and we wave back, and we have never brought it up again. I've been a search and rescue volunteer in the Cascades for 11 years. I want to put that up front because I think it matters for how you hear what I'm about to tell you. I am not a person who panics in the backcountry. I have recovered bodies. I have been on multi-day missions in whiteout conditions. I am, by disposition and by training, someone who looks for rational explanations first and holds on to them as long as they hold. What I'm going to tell you is 3 separate incidents from 3 separate years that I've never fully put together in the same telling before, partly because I wasn't sure what it meant to put them together. The first was year 2. A missing hiker, male 47, had gone out alone on a day hike and not come back. We were searching a drainage below a ridge that he told his wife he planned to hike. I was with a partner, a woman who'd been on the team longer than me, and we were working a grid methodically, which is what you do. It was a clear morning, good visibility, not difficult terrain. Around mid-morning, my partner stopped walking. I stopped too. She was staring at something about 200 feet up the slope from us, at the base of a rocky outcrop. I looked, and I couldn't see anything clearly. It was in shadow. She said, in a level voice, "There's something at the base of that rock." I agreed there was something, and we started toward it, calling out. It was a pile of clothing, not scattered, not like someone had been in distress, folded, carefully folded, in a neat pile at the base of the rock. A jacket, a fleece, a pair of hiking pants, a boot, only one boot. The clothing was the correct size for an adult male and matched the description given by the family. There was no one near the clothing. We found the man about 4 hours later, on the other side of the ridge entirely, well outside the zone he'd told his wife he was hiking. He was physically fine, dehydrated, but not seriously, and he was not wearing the clothing we'd found. He was wearing the other items from the description, but not what we'd discovered at the rock. He had no explanation for the clothing. He said it wasn't his. The size and description matched. His family identified it. He became upset when we pressed him on it and said he just wanted to go home. We logged the clothing and moved on. My partner never said another word about it on that mission, and I matched her energy. The second incident was year 6. We were searching for a missing girl, 14, who'd gone up a trail above a campground with a group of friends and hadn't come back down. The friends said they'd gotten separated on the way back and assumed she'd gotten down ahead of them. This is not unusual. Teenagers make bad decisions in the backcountry. Judgment calls don't get made. Someone goes ahead without telling anyone. We were operational by early evening and through the night. In the early morning hours, I was part of a team that was working the upper section of the trail, above the point where the kids had said they'd gotten separated. I had a radio and a headlamp, and I was moving methodically, calling her name at intervals, the way we do. At some point, and this is the part I find hardest to articulate, I had a very strong, clear sense that something was nearby. I don't know a better way to say it. It wasn't a sound I consciously heard, it wasn't a sight. It was closer to the way you can sometimes sense someone standing behind you in a dark room. A presence, very close. I stopped walking and held my headlamp out and turned in a slow circle. Nothing, but here's what stays with me when I made that circle. There was a 3 to 4 second window where my headlamp was facing away from the slope above me, and during that window I heard something move. Not an animal, too deliberate, too measured in pace, like footsteps. 1, 2, 3, and then nothing. I swept my light back up the slope. Nothing there. We found the girl at first light, huddled under a rock overhang about 300 meters above where I'd been standing. She was cold and scared and completely okay, and her first question was whether those people had found us. I asked what she meant. She said she'd seen lights on the slope during the night, 2 of them, moving together, and she'd been afraid to call out because she didn't know who it was. Our team hadn't been running 2 lights on that section. I checked the logs. No other team was in that zone. She is fine. She went home with her family. I've thought about her question probably once a week since then. The third incident is recent, 2 years ago. A man in his early 70s, experienced outdoorsman, had gone into a remote section of the range for a solo photography trip and was reported overdue by 48 hours. By the time we were operational, the window was getting narrow. We found his camp on day 2. Intact, organized camera equipment still there. Everything exactly as it should be, except that he wasn't in it. The fire had been out long enough that the ash was cold, but no longer damp from morning dew. We estimated he'd been gone 36 to 40 hours. About half a mile from the camp, we found his tracks in a muddy section of trail, and then the track stopped, not at a rocky section, not at a stream crossing, not at any terrain feature that would explain an absence of prints. The trail continued soft mud, and his tracks simply stopped, as if he'd been lifted off the ground in mid-stride. We searched for 4 days. We never found him. No remains, no gear beyond the campsite, no sign of a fall or an accident. The case is technically still open. I looked it up last year. I don't know what happened to him. I've sat with that for 2 years. I don't have a framework that fits any of those 3 things, individually or together, and I've been doing this long enough that I have a framework for most things. What I do know is that the mountain doesn't always give back what goes in. That's not a horror story. That's just the job. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and every few years we do a big family trip, something to get everyone in the same place for more than a day, because we all live in different states and it gets harder every year. 2 winters ago, we rented a large cabin in the mountains of Western Virginia. 7 adults, 3 kids under 8, 1 dog. A week. The full, chaotic family gathering you can picture. The cabin was big, 3 floors, 6 bedrooms, a massive open great room with a loft above it. It was in good shape, recently renovated, with the kind of decor that tries to be rustic without being shabby. It was nice. We all liked it. On the second day, my youngest nephew, who was 5 at the time, started talking about the man upstairs. He brought it up the same way kids bring up anything, just as part of a sentence. He was eating breakfast and said something like, "I don't want to go upstairs because of the man." We asked what he meant. He said, perfectly matter of fact, that there was a man up in the loft who watched them when they played. You know how you handle this when you're a parent or an aunt or an uncle. You stay calm, you ask a few gentle questions, you don't make it bigger than it needs to be. Kids have active imaginations. My nephew was at an age where the line between what he saw and what he imagined was genuinely fluid. We looked around the loft, found nothing, told him it was empty, and moved on. He said again that evening that the man was watching. Now, the cabin's loft was open to the great room below. You could look over the railing from up there and see everything: the couch, the dining table, the kitchen. The loft itself had 2 bean bags and a kids' area that the 3 little ones had mostly taken over. My nephew refused to go up there for the rest of the trip. The specific detail that I keep coming back to is something he said on the 3rd day, when my sister sat with him and asked him to tell her more about the man so she could understand. He thought about it and then said, "He looks like he's asleep, but he's not, because his eyes are open." My sister called me that night and repeated it. Neither of us slept well after. There was one other thing. On the last day, helping pack up, I went into the storage closet behind the loft to get some boxes we'd stacked in there. The closet had a vent in the back wall, a simple metal floor vent, low to the ground. The vent cover was lying flat on the floor, removed from the opening. I don't know if it had been like that the whole trip and we hadn't noticed, or if it had been moved at some point. I looked into the vent shaft. Ductwork, dark, nothing unusual. I put the cover back. I packed the boxes. I didn't mention it to anyone until months later. My nephew doesn't talk about the man upstairs anymore. If you ask him about that trip, he gets quiet, and then he says he doesn't want to talk about the cabin. He's 7 now. He used to not be a particularly serious kid. I'll keep this one short, because the most important part of it is short. I was 31, solo backpacking, a 6-day trip in a wilderness area in Wyoming that I'd planned for over a year. No trails for most of it, cross-country navigation, map and compass, the kind of trip that requires prep and rewards it. I was comfortable and experienced and properly equipped. On the 4th day, I came over a high ridge and into a basin I'd been looking forward to. A cirque lake, very remote, the kind of place where you might go years between human visitors. The lake was everything I'd hoped. I set up camp. I ate. I watched the light change for a couple of hours and then went to sleep feeling genuinely happy. I woke in the night, I don't know what time, I didn't check, to the specific, unmistakable sound of someone walking around my tent. I'm not being dramatic. Footsteps, 2-legged, bipedal, relatively slow, circling, not a bear. I know what a bear sounds like around camp. I've had the experience. This was lighter, more deliberate, Unhurried, I lay there, very still, and listened to it go all the way around the tent once, and then start a second circuit. I called out, loudly, clearly, "Hello? Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Total silence for what felt like 2 full minutes. And then they started again, but moving away this time, down the slope away from my campsite, and then nothing. In the morning, I looked at the ground around my tent very carefully. The soil wasn't soft enough to show clear prints everywhere, but on the downhill side, where the ground was slightly damper, there was a disturbance, a series of partial impressions, not clear enough to photograph convincingly, that seemed consistent in spacing with a human stride. I finished my trip on the last night before I reached the trailhead. Camped in a more standard spot, I made myself think through every possible explanation. Another backpacker who'd camped nearby and walked past without speaking. Some kind of wildlife, my own imagination amplified by solo travel and altitude. What I can't fully explain away is that after the footsteps stopped when I called out, when they resumed and moved away, they moved away at the same pace. Not spooked, not running, just deliberate, unhurried, moving away. Whatever it was, it left when I asked it to. I find that either comforting or the most disturbing part, depending on the day. I worked a ski season in a mountain resort town in Colorado. I was 24, between real jobs, the kind of thing you do when you're young and don't have reasons not to. I got a room in a shared apartment, which was normal for seasonal workers, with 3 roommates I'd never met before I arrived. 2 of them were fine, normal, became people I still have contact with. The third, I'll call him Marcus, though that wasn't his name, was quietly strange in a way that was hard to articulate at first. Not threatening, not even unfriendly, just off, like he was always slightly out of sync with the conversation, like he was performing normalcy instead of doing it naturally. He worked night mountain patrol, which meant he was asleep when we left for work and gone when we came home. We rarely interacted. About 6 weeks in, one of my other roommates mentioned that Marcus didn't sleep in his room. She'd gone by his door and heard nothing, ever, and one day when he'd left it open, she'd seen the bed was made with the tight, undisturbed flatness of a bed that hadn't been slept in. We told ourselves he was working nights and sleeping elsewhere, a girlfriend's place, a co-worker's couch. One evening in January I came home early, shift cut short, and the apartment was quiet. Marcus's door was shut. I went to the kitchen, made something to eat, was sitting at the table. About 20 minutes in I realized I hadn't heard any sound from his room, no movement, no phone, nothing. Just silence, but a specific kind, the kind that feels occupied. I don't know why I knocked. It wasn't like me to bother him, but I knocked and said I was making food if he wanted any. There was a pause, and then he said, from what sounded like directly behind the door, very close, "I'll be out in a bit." He wasn't out in a bit. He wasn't out at all that evening. I sat in the common room for 3 hours, and his door didn't open. The last strange thing was the window in the hallway. Our apartment was on the 3rd floor, and the hallway between the bedrooms had a single window that looked out onto the back of the building, a fire escape landing, and then a drop to the alley below. A few days before the end of the season, I noticed the window was open. It had been open for at least 2 or 3 days, because the carpet below the sill was damp from overnight cold. I went to close it. On the outside of the glass, On the third floor, there was a handprint, pressed flat, fingers spread wide, like someone had braced themselves against the outside of the window. There was no landing at that window, just the glass, and below it the fire escape, and below that the alley. I closed the window. The season ended 3 weeks later. I haven't thought about Marcus without also thinking about that handprint. I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about what it means that the print was on the outside, that it was facing out, that whatever made it was on the outside, pressing in. That's 8 stories, 8 people who went into the mountains, or just to the edge of them, and came back with something they couldn't leave there. I hope you're somewhere warm right now. I hope you've got the volume low and somewhere comfortable to settle in. If any of these stories felt familiar, if you've got something you haven't told anyone, you know where to find me. Drop it in the comments. I read everything. Stay safe. Stay inside when the birds go quiet. Good night.